there in Zoom land. My name is Justin Russell. I am the Principal Director of the New York Center for Foreign Policy Affairs, and this is another one of a series of webinars that we are doing here at the Center. This time we are going to be talking about the 2020 election, how we get here, how the election is going in the age of COVID, and what can we expect over the next 2 months as we lead into Election Day 2020. We are very, very fortunate to have not only two really dear friends of mine, but two great political minds, both in Washington and in journalism, in political journalism and political strategy. Let me start off first with well, you know, I just realized that this is like the old backroom politics. I can do the old backroom politics introductions, and we'll get to that after our webinar. But joining us from Washington, D.C. is the attorney and political strategist who is a former Democratic and Joe Biden political operative. He is the one that we know as Dan Lipner, Esquire. Dan, how are you?
I'm doing well. Glad to be here, Justin.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. And also with us, he is the #1 New York Times best-selling author of Shattered and the author of New York Times best-selling book HRC. He is also the chief political reporter for NBC News and NBC News Digital. Did I get that right, John?
Senior political analyst for NBC News Digital, but you were close. Good enough.
I was close. Okay. Jonathan Allen. John, thanks for joining us on this. Really appreciate it. Hey, so let's get into this. We're going to dig right in. Usually, for those who've been to our other webinars, we usually do 5-minute introductory position pieces by our speakers. But, you know, this is such a robust election season. This is such a robust topic. I figured we could dig right in. And let's start with how we got to where we are today in the election. And I want to start off with, obviously, the Republicans, Donald Trump being the incumbent president, was going to get the nomination short of something disastrous happening. But let's look at the Democrats. And I'm going to start with you, Dan. Dan, we've got Joe Biden, who is largely looked at favorably by many in Washington circles. He's been largely looked at as a moderate, not so much the far left side of the party. But Joe Biden had a real fight to get to where he is today. The first question I want to ask you is, why was it so hard for Joe Biden to get his footing established in the party to get the nomination ultimately?
I mean, it's a worthwhile question, since the early states in the process, that being most notably Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada, Biden didn't do, he had his best performance ever for him during the caucuses this cycle in Iowa, but that still wasn't a win. He didn't do terribly well in Nevada, and I'm actually drawing a blank on how he did it in New Hampshire. But then enter South Carolina, where you have a different group of folks and more people who are more likely to be considered the party stalwarts, even though South Carolina is not a Democratic state. The voters in South Carolina, majority African American for Democrats in South Carolina, and that was where everything changed. And you saw numbers that you never saw before with everything that came afterwards. Elizabeth Warren ended up losing in Massachusetts for her primary there, for the presidential primary there. Joe Biden won in Virginia, huge, after spending no money. And that pretty much continued throughout the primaries. It was an impressive difference, and I would actually have to say probably the biggest way that we got here is the non-Twitter vote that was voting, meaning the blue checkmark Democrats, who kind of are disproportionately represented in the caucus structure
Right.
because of just how the system works, and the folks who are more traditional Democrats that, as Jim Clyburn said, we know Joe, and the folks that knew Joe Biden for his long history of work in Democratic politics essentially turned out for the decency that he's always existed for, and also the continuity of Democratic principles. And that's kind of how he ended up being the nominee. And in a walk, I mean, Bernie Sanders was the last man standing on the fight, but at the end of the day, it was just Joe Biden.
So, John Allen, I mean, your number one best-selling book, Shattered, pretty much went over the progress of the Republican primary into the general election between Trump and Hillary. When we look at the primary of 2016 and the Republicans and the primary of the Democrats of 2020, are there any similarities to this? I mean, such a broad field, really it was a wheel spin of who could possibly be the nominee? Or why is it now we see Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, both of them were not strong early on in the primaries? How did we get to here?
Well, I think in both cases you saw voters, essentially reject what we all thought were the litmus tests for the two parties. So in the Republican primary in 2016, there was a whole set of issue tests that all of the candidates thought they were going to have to perform for the voters and say, look, I'm the most conservative on this, I'm the most conservative on that. And it turned out that Donald Trump had his own issue set he thought was addressing, various issues, but mostly in a lot of ways just a personality test of what kind of leader he would be. And he expressed it through the America First umbrella. So there was protectionism around that there was building the wall, his stance on immigration around that, but largely sort of around Donald Trump himself, less around issues, and certainly not around, who had the most anti-abortion plank, or take the issue on the litmus test. Same thing with, I think, to some degree with Joe Biden in the Democratic primary this time around. He is a more centrist candidate than most of the 24 other Democrats that ran. And when you looked at what he was talking about, sure, there were policies that backed up his platform, but really what he rolled out early on was, as Dan was saying, sort of, me, I'm Joe. He started with the highest name recognition in the Democratic primary, somebody who'd been vice president for 8 years. And he really tried to make a character argument, tried to talk about his personal traits in a way that I think appealed to two sets in the Democratic Party that were very important. Number one, essentially the working class white voters that had been potential swing voters from Obama to Trump over the course of, from 2008 to 2012 to 2016. Some of them had gone from Obama to Trump. And then also you're looking at the African-American voters that Dan was talking about. And both of those sets lined up really well for Joe Biden. And talking about his character issues was something that worked for him very well in the primary. So I think you had two candidates that really were trying to get out of the mold of let's have a fight about a lot of specific issues.
Dan Lipner, let me go to you. The question that comes up when we talk about this is, for example, what we saw in the Republican primary of 2016 versus the Democratic Party primary of 2020 is a very dramatic shift to the outer fringes of the party. That's where we got a lot of the very progressive side of the popular Democratic candidates that showed up. Is that a page straight out of the 2016 Republican book, as John was pointing out, where we started seeing more fringe, more involvement from what we would call the base, and that seems to be what's driving primary politics right now? You're on mute, Dan. Sorry. Dan, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, I muted myself, but I was unable to unmute. So the answer is sort of. So the blue check mark, if for those who aren't familiar, the blue check mark Democrats are folks who literally check themselves as Democrats on Twitter, and they kind of represent the activist base for at least online. But that still didn't quite explain everything. So Bernie Sanders did well in Iowa, but Mayor Pete was actually the biggest loser because he won but wasn't able to call it on election night. And while Mayor Pete is a progressive, he kind of campaigned against some of the more radical issues that were put out there on the Bernie Sanders wing, or even by the Elizabeth Warren wing. And also Amy Klobuchar, who is far from a radical, also ended up representing herself fairly well. She was she went pretty far into the primary season. Heading off to New Hampshire, where now having looked it up, Sanders did indeed win, but he still didn't exactly swamp Buttigieg or Warren. And again, Warren did make a play for the far left. And once you began to leave those groups or those states, is where you saw the rise of the moderate, more established Democrat. I'm hesitant to say establishment Democrat because Biden, while he has served in office for 40-some years, he was never part of the inside the Beltway club since he didn't stick around. He went home every night. Well, it's just not a campaign shtick. But in the mess of people looking for a place to coalesce around a single individual, it actually, and this is actually to John Allen's point, the personality that was at play in the Republican contest in 2016. It's hard pressed to say what Donald Trump's positions were on any issue other than building a wall, and some of the rather inciting racial language he used, but there were no true policy positions beyond that. Joe Biden, while he does have policy positions, in essence, what the personality trait that people kind of gravitated to is the decency.
But Dan, let me just
that's the contrast.
All right, but Dan, let me jump in and ask this question, and I want to follow up, John, the same question to you as well. But you're talking about Joe Biden, who couldn't literally get above 30% going into 2020, into the early states. Kamala Harris was one of the earliest to close down her campaign in seeking the Democratic nomination. You now have two people who were not front-runner noted all-stars who are now at the top and second tier of the ticket. Is that just the Democratic Party got smart and said, this is the way we're going to win? Or are they really rolling dice that we're going to bank on getting the moderates and we may tick off some of the base, but that's a risk we're willing to take? Oh, Steve Clemens is joining us. Steve is on mute, by the way, Alyssa. Steve Clemens, the editor-at-large from The Hill. How you doing, Steve?
Doing great. Good to see all of you, and my apologies for getting stuck in bridge traffic. I did not anticipate, so my apologies.
No. We're glad you're here. We're glad you're here. So just to catch you up, we're talking about how we got to the current slate, how we got from the primary to now, and then this is a great lead-in for you because I'm going to ask you the same question. But Dan, I go back to you. Is taking the two kind of early out, not really early favorites, and putting them at the heart of the ticket, is that a win for the establishment, or are they just willing to roll dice that they're going to tick off some of the base?
No, no. Well, I don't think writing Kamala Harris off as not one of the favorites on the front end is correct. Kamala Harris had the biggest kickoff event of anyone else's kickoff event for this primary season. She had, I believe it was 25,000 people show up for her announcement, which was huge. Nobody saw that coming. And compared to Bernie Sanders' army, which is pretty established, didn't turn out anywhere near those kind of numbers. Elizabeth Warren was having great numbers as far as turnout for events. So it was kind of all over the map. Joe Biden, on the other hand, was Joe Biden. He had the folks that kind of knew him, and he was sort of a fallback between everyone's second and third choice. And as things progressed, that's where he began to grow his lead. Now, everyone else may have stumbled, but Joe Biden, for his history of occasionally saying things he wished he had on camera, that's all kind of cooked into the numbers. And that's where he came from. So it wasn't so much not being everyone's first choice. He was there, and it was a safe choice. So I don't know if it was any kind of greater in-depth policy choice that the Democratic Party was looking at, or Democratic Party voters, because Democrats aren't a monolithic group. It was well, no, he's kind of there with us on all of these issues, and he's been there for 40 years. It's not something that changed on policy position on a debate stage at any point during the campaign.
John Allen, do you agree?
Well, I mean, certainly it's a lot of millions of individuals making a choice that at the end looks like a collective decision. But I think what you could say is the vast majority of Democrats didn't want Bernie Sanders to be their nominee. And as time went on, there was a group that feared that Bernie Sanders was going to win the Democratic nomination, and another group that feared the longer the nomination process went on, the uglier it would be for him to be defeated, at a convention, or the harder it would be for the party to come together at the end of a primary process. And so what you saw was after Biden looked strong with his big win in South Carolina, I think faster than anybody anticipated, this real coalescing of not only Democratic voters, but the Democratic candidates that were still running behind Biden as their choice. But Biden became the first among equals, or the strongest of the candidates in the Stop Bernie movement, as much as anything else.
So if I could just follow up on this point. So I think the best contrast is actually 2004, where when John Kerry became the nominee, it was more than just the anti-Dean vote. There was a portion of, and I'd heard it significantly more in 2004, where Democratic activists were also playing armchair strategists. And John Kerry, on paper, as a war hero during the height of the Iraq War, was actually more part of the thinking in 2004 than any kind of strategy work, for the armchair strategy work within Democratic politics this cycle.
Steve Clemens, but when we bring up Joe Biden, we bring up South Carolina. When we bring up South Carolina, we have to bring up Jim Clyburn. I mean, is Jim Clyburn the savior of the Biden campaign, and possibly the savior of the Democratic Party as it relates to trying to centerize versus going totally progressive?
Well, I think that, have I lost you? I hope I haven't lost you here.
No, you have not. We can hear you.
Great. I think, so I agree with everything John Allen just shared, and a lot of what Dan just said. I think Jim Clyburn gave permission to the Black community to be enthusiastic about where they thought they needed to go. And, I've had a conversation. I sort of see some things different. I agree with John that Joe Biden was the anti-Bernie character, but I think people are misreading something. And I had a discussion with Cornel West this week where he was, calling Trump the fascist and Biden the neoliberal. And that couldn't be a greater misreading of who Joe Biden is and what he represents. Biden was the one guy in the Obama camp who wanted to rewrite the social contract for workers, who did not want to go down the Larry Summers, Gene Sperling, Tim Geithner way in the aftermath of the 08-09 financial crisis. And so there's a lot of that element of Biden's past that has been forgotten. So to typify him as a kind of easy alternative to Bernie Sanders, politically, yes, but when it comes down to, neoliberalism versus, kind of micro progressivism, if you will, Joe Biden is much more progressive than Geithner, Summers, Obama himself on looking at what that dimension is. And I think that's what appealed to the Jim Clyburns and others. So I think he gave it. Now, I think that the broader side that I think you folks were getting into about, who is the conventional win or not, I have to tell you, interviewing the mayor of Atlanta, Kasem Reed, years ago, who told me as he was retiring and picking his successor, he said, Steve, our plan is to get Joe Biden leading the ticket and Kamala Harris on with him. So however they got there and with whatever jabs, that level of Black second tier political player in Washington preferred and wanted a Biden Kamala Harris ticket before we'd even seen all the alternatives. So I just wanted to add that to the discussion.
Yeah.
It was very interesting to see this come together.
No. That's fantastic. But is this a situation where, Steve, I'll go back to you on this. Is this a situation where, let's be honest, the Democrats are known for snatching total defeat out of certain victory? Is this a truly strategic, smart play in the Democratic Party that they're saying, look, we're going to hit all the boxes, hit all the marks. We've got somebody who's establishment, who knows how the game's played. We've got a woman of color who's on the ticket. We've got West Coast, East Coast. This is a strategy that seems like certain victory, but it's the Democrats.
But it may be checking off all the boxes too comfortably and neatly. I mean, I used to feel that by going with Joe Biden early on, if they did do it, which they hadn't yet, the Democrats were trying to preempt the Democratic Civil War within their own caucus. When we saw that Civil War kind of burst out and get tucked back in, it's still there. I think the Bernie wing, the Elizabeth Warrens, the AOCs are very uncomfortable with what Joe Biden has come to mean, which is a catch-all candidate who seems bland and unexciting. And many people will tell you the same thing about Kamala Harris, being somebody that checks off a lot of boxes, but has not really brought that sizzle to that ticket. So I think you've got something there for a moment, which is right, trying to be, cover all the bases, to be bland, to be conventional. I have to tell you, and I don't know if, John or Dan or others have been hearing this from the Biden, camp, but people who've been devout Biden players for a long time are leaking out how idea void the campaign is. It's nothing like what Obama did. That was a rich, fertile ground for debating different ideas that might be great for the country. There's nothing like that seems to be going on in sort of the think tank part of the Biden campaign, which is another interesting piece of the puzzle.
Dan Lipner, you agree?
I sort of. So you also have to be attentive to strategy when talking about this. And I sort of challenge the number of ideas that flowed out of the Obama campaign in 08 as well. However, the RNC for the first time in their history had no platform. It was basically literally the cult of Trump. Whatever your leaders says he is good within the Republican Party, which is sort of insane. That said, as far as the campaign platforms and campaign ideas, in a world that Nancy Pelosi is getting pilloried on right-wing media for getting her hair blown out, the giving ammunition to the other side that is sinking. I mean, Trump's poll numbers everywhere aren't great. I was just looking at some rather surprising numbers to me, exactly how poorly he was doing in both Arizona and Wisconsin. And in that in both of those situations, or both of those states, why would you needlessly give ammunition that will be disruptive to an opponent who, for every one of his actions, seems to be causing more harm? Now, that might not be the best thing in terms of macro democracy when talking about ideas, but at the same time, you're also talking about the general ideas that people kind of know what's out there, as well as the contrast in personality. Unfortunately, American politics sort of devolved into the contrast of personalities. George W. Bush famously, while all of the issues in 2000, something like 7 or 8 out of 10, all favored Al Gore, where George W. Bush won as somebody they felt more comfortable having a beer with. So that's far from a policy position, and it's more on the who people are comfortable with, both as their leader and trusting with
Right.
government. So if
Right.
that's really the question at hand, why would you open up yourself for other attacks?
John Allen.
Dan brings up polling, and just a couple things. One is, obviously you read polls, and Biden has a significant lead in national polling, if not one that should make him start spiking the football in the end zone. But two, his leads, if you look at the state-by-state polling, are not terribly dissimilar from what Hillary Clinton's looked like at this point in the 2016 campaign. That is to say, it's not like he's winning battleground states by 10, 12 points. So just to keep that in mind, we're not, I think both sides expect this to be a close race in the end. And I don't think anybody's doing any celebration dances right now. The other thing that I look at in polling that I think is really interesting is the one area that Trump has continually been strong on, either leading Biden or tied with Biden, even though he's trailed on almost every other issue, and has, we've seen damage to his campaign from his handling of coronavirus and other things, is on the economy. Even though the economy essentially tanked during the coronavirus crisis, it looks like voters have continued to give him credit for, what the economy did in the first couple of years of his administration, which was a continuation of the 4 years of Obama, with some sugar rush injection of tax cuts and other policies. But Trump is doing well in polling against Biden on the economy. And when I think about what is it that swing voters are going to think about as they go into the polls, and what is it what swing voters in swing states are going to think about, I always think that one of those things is pocketbook issues. And so one of the questions I ask myself, and one of the questions I want to ask folks down the road the next couple of months as I'm reporting, is what is the key, and how are you going to gauge your question of what does your wallet look like? What do the wallets of your neighbors look like in 2021, 22, 23, and 24 in terms of a Trump presidency or a Biden presidency?
Well, Steve, John brings up a good point here. When we look at the polling numbers, Pew Research Center just did a poll with registered voters, the most important topics for them in the 2020 election. 79% say the economy, 68% say healthcare, 64% say Supreme Court appointees, 62% say the corona outbreak. You're still talking, 3 out of 4 that say the economy. And if you look at the economy today, job numbers just came out. We're now under 10% unemployment, whereas at the peak it was almost at 14. Stock markets were until midweek hitting record highs on the NASDAQ, Standard & Poor's, and Dow Jones. People are seeing money in their bank. They're seeing the jobs come back. If that's the case, does Trump, all he have to do is say, look at your 401k account, make me your president, it'll keep going?
Basically, when you add on to that, the fact that he was taking credit for the checks and, some illusory, payroll tax exemptions.
Right.
I think when you have that package of things, whether or not he's really delivered to that Kansas farmer, and his or her circumstances. When you look at the trade arena, it's a depression out there. When you look at, but he's able to create at least the illusion of economic gains for the country on all the basis, and I think that's why he's polling. I think that's basically that and terrorism are the two categories that he really does trump Joe Biden on. I think that one thing to keep in mind, though, that's important is that something else was going on, and I think that's why this Jeff Goldberg piece in the Atlantic, may be very important. I interviewed Biden when Hillary was running against Trump, and Biden had said the Democratic Party then in 2016 had become a party of snobs, that the party was disconnected from that average struggling American out there. And I think what you've just raised is really important, is does that person have a way back to Joe Biden and his franchise now or not? And I think that John's questions are going to be very important. Part of it is, what does their pocketbook, their wallet look like? The other part of it, which Trump may just have, screwed up, is, are we being treated with dignity? Are we being celebrated? Because they felt like the New York financial sector dominated Democratic Party demeaned Americans, demeaned military service. It was military families, many of whom many of my relatives supported Trump, because they felt as if they had been demeaned and they had lost their jobs in the 08-09 financial crisis, even though they had served in Iraq and Afghanistan and countless wars before. So I think there's an element there that goes beyond the economic, the personal transaction on whether they've done well or not. Most of them probably haven't done well. But I think the other bit of it is whether or not they feel like Joe Biden and the Democratic Party have come around and are just less snobbish.
Dan Lipner, you agree?
Yeah, no, I actually think that the perceived elitism of the Democratic Party, I absolutely agree with that. It's unfortunate that, and there's been poll numbers for years basically suggesting that most people don't realize or don't know that the Democratic Party is traditionally the party of working people. And part of the reasoning for that, Claire McCaskill in a after she had lost her Senate race, spoke about stopping at a gas station and saying, the story was a gentleman came up there and said, "Hey yo," which in her words translated to "Excuse me, Madam Senator." But this patron approached her and she went over and talked to him, and he told her that, well, I know the Democratic Party is for African Americans, and I know the Democratic Party is there for Hispanics. I know the Democratic Party is there for women, but I don't know the Democratic Party is there for me. And that's part of the narrative that occasionally gets left off. And not that the Democratic Party isn't there for working class folks, but because of just how many messages are out there, and the Democratic coalition is pretty diverse. It makes it difficult to have the much vaunted message discipline to just have the message that actually appeals to all groups simultaneously. And that's something that Donald Trump kind of doesn't have as much of a problem with, even though he frequently says all things and all sides of a position during one speech and occasionally one sentence. But the Democratic approach is more challenging. But there's also a fair amount that's taken note of it and really begun to pull that back. And the Joe Biden narrative, where he still tells a story about his dad losing a job, and the reason they moved to Delaware is because there was good work there or good jobs there. So that narrative is paying attention to the folks who have felt excluded by not necessarily Democratic policies, but Democratic talking points.
So, John Allen, I guess the question comes up now that says, it seems to me that the blue-collar, lunch-pail moderates could be the key deciding factor in this coming up election, COVID or not. It's still about economics. It's still about jobs. It's still about, even when we do come up with a vaccine, am I still going to have a job to go back to? Can Joe Biden bring that sector back to him, being that in years past he's been the darling of the trade unions, cops, firefighters, the hardcore blue-collar working man loved him, and now he's a puppet of the elite? Or can Donald Trump actually keep those voters in his realm and surprise everybody, including the pollsters?
I mean, there are data analysts being paid a lot of money on both campaigns to figure this out. And what we've seen in political campaigns for a long time is this huge desire to turn toward bases and find new universes of voters to turn out, people who agree with you, to identify them and turn them out. You know, what's interesting to me is the sort of basic math of this, which is the highest value voter is the one who is going to vote anyway, who will vote no matter what, but that you might be able to pull over from the other side, because that's +1 for you and -1 for the other side, rather than someone you identify new and bring into yours, which is just a +1. I mean, this is the most simple formula in the world, and yet it's very, very time consuming and difficult to find those people who you might be able to convince and pull over. But I think what you're seeing from Biden has been an effort, you know, to a much greater degree than we saw from Hillary Clinton in 2016, to actually persuade voters to move from one side to the other. On the Trump side, what you're seeing more of is an effort to dissuade Democratic voters from showing up, to sort of tamp down enthusiasm for Biden, and in some cases to try to keep Trump voters on his side that might have drifted over toward the Democratic side in say the midterm elections. We're seeing that with the fight, for instance, for non-college educated suburban white voters. You know, that's a lot of what we're seeing with this fight over policing and protests and counter protests, and so that's a lot of what the discussion is around. You know, what Trump calls abolishing the suburbs, which is basically a policy Biden supports, in which local housing authorities would be denied federal funds if they didn't affirmatively pursue efforts to integrate neighborhoods.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, because Steve Clemens, when we look at Joe Biden, I mean, Joe Biden gave us the crime bill, which he is taking some heat on of recent. He has been a friend of organizations such as the FOP, the PBA. He has been very much a friend of criminal justice, but now he's being portrayed as this puppet of anarchy and Antifa and the rest of those, as Trump puts it, terroristic organizations. Is there something to be said about the fact that Trump has literally established himself as saying, look, we just want safety for all Americans, versus Joe Biden, who is going to play into the ultra left? Is that going to be Joe Biden's Achilles heel, or is that actually a benefit for Joe Biden? And is it vice versa?
Well, I think right now it's a problem for Joe Biden. You know, I think he's begun to try and address it by his comments in Kenosha that were balanced. And I think if you go back to other key players like Jim Clyburn, who's been talking against mob action and for a deliberateness in these protests, and a deliberateness about everything from statues to, you know, achieving racial dignity and justice. And so, but I think that what we're seeing, you know, and I don't want to, you know, be a purveyor of conspiracy theories, but someone is driving protests around the country. I was just talking to someone in the cabinet of Governor Wolf's cabinet in Pennsylvania, you know, who said in Philadelphia there's a new homeless camp that has come up, and some folks are staying there, and that the nuns in the area who've known the homeless very, very well for years and years said all of these people are from other places. Some agent is creating certain tensions. You know, is anybody saying Russia or something? You know, no, but something out there is driving this so that people feel great anxiety about Black Lives Matter, the organization, about the protests they're seeing, about the violence, and it's designed to scare the independent voter that hasn't made up his or her mind. And that is what people have been saying. This is, the piece that just also ran in the Atlantic on how Joe Biden could lose by not defining himself in that center as being also a law and order guy, but somebody who understands that dignity, no police brutality is also part of that equation. But right now, Donald Trump is winning the game because of the fear that people feel, in the suburbs and the cities.
John Allen, I mean, Steve brings up a great point in the fact is, has this now become a head-to-head game versus the Trump camp, which is arguably winning the argument on having law and order versus anarchy and domestic terrorism, versus Biden, who can possibly handle COVID better? Trump's numbers on COVID are dismal at best. Is this going to be a fight for which issue taps the voters more, or is this going to be a dead heat?
I mean, certainly, what's foremost in voters' minds is something, and which voters and in which states certainly is important to defining who's going to win an election. I'm not sure that the evidence is clear cut that Trump is winning on this argument over policing and protests. I think what is clear is that he's coming down on one side of it. And what also is clear is that Biden is trying to walk a tightrope where he shows sympathy, compassion, some support for the protesters, and also voices support for order. And I think what he's trying to say is that in order to have a just justice system, you actually have to have a system that works, one that works for law enforcement, one that works for those who are accused, one that works for everybody and is in fact fair and follows a rule of law. And that right now there are many examples in which that is not the case. And I think, he would likely point to examples of the president of the United States acting outside of what he would see as the rule of law. So, I think he's walking a tightrope, and it's not that sort of, very clear-cut position that the president has, which is very much on one side of it. That doesn't necessarily mean that the president wins that argument. The question is going to be, I think, for voters who are focused on that, whether they see complexity in it. You've got Biden running as somebody who has empathy for everyone, says he wants to bring everyone together, bring everyone to the table. And the president who really is showing sort of compassion for one side of it. Are the people that are focused on it going to spend more and persuadable going to look at that and say, that's how I feel that this is really a clear-cut issue on just one side?
Dan Lipner, to that point, is Joe Biden kind of caught in a rock and a hard spot right now as far as being empathetic to the call for police reform, at the same time him having a history of supporting police, law enforcement, the criminal justice system? How does he walk this tightrope, I guess?
Well, so I'm not certain I agree with the analogy of a tightrope. So traditionally, Democrats always have a far more difficult time talking about issues in a nuanced way because it doesn't necessarily fit easily on a bumper sticker. That said, the no less than Karl Rove this last weekend pointed out on one of his interviews that no president has ever won the presidency or been reelected to the presidency by just going after their base. They did something to pull over moderates or independents to their camp in order to win. And in spite of the 2016 where Trump eked out a narrow victory based on 3 Midwestern states, you have to contrast that with how he's running his election this time around. Before it was, what do you have to lose? So he was the law and order candidate then, in spite of the fact that you have disorder now. And the idea of just trying to get more folks activated is, it's not quite clear to me where more of the base or the Republican base is that are going to turn out, or who in the middle is going to be spurred by the fanning of those particular flames. So again, not saying it's a conspiracy theory or not, but the idea of scaring folks in the suburbs about the chaos in the streets, some of these streets aren't chaotic, and the folks that are scared of the other, that we see on online media and people being truly reactionary, I think those folks were already there. The doom and gloom that Donald Trump talked about in his inaugural address about the cities being in turmoil, that was a plea to his base unnecessarily during his inauguration, and it was a world that most other Americans weren't seeing. And
Right.
while you didn't have the protests that you have today, even then, Portland, the city of Portland, put out a map of where the protests are, highlighting in red exactly where the protests in Portland are occurring. And remarkably, it's a pretty small area of the city of Portland. And while I'm far from an expert on what's going on every place in the country, it's hard for me to believe there's mass chaos that most people are seeing in those localities. Right. So I think it's sort of activating the people who are already scared.
Right. Little bit of a housekeeping note here. First of all, number one, at the last 10 minutes of the seminars, we usually open it up for questions. If you have a question for one of our panelists, please type it into the chat function on Zoom and tell us who the question is for. We'll read it on the air for you. And we are going to go a little bit longer because we started a little bit longer due to technical issues. So we're going to go a little bit longer, if that's all right with our panel. If we can keep you around for another 15 minutes, that'd be fantastic. A thumbs up for everybody. Fantastic. Let's keep going a little bit on this before we go into opening up for questions. Steve Clemens, the issue of COVID. Is this a situation where the great electorate, how do I put this? The great equalizer in all this is going to be the vaccine. If we get a vaccine before Election Day that seems to be credible, it goes to Trump and economics. If we don't, it's a failure of the Trump administration. This goes to Biden. Or is it not that big of a deal?
I think that the qualifier that you just added there is if it seems credible. I don't think there's anyone who's sane who will necessarily think there's a credible vaccine that will be available before Election Day. So what happens is, whether you're talking about any dimension of the COVID crisis, you're talking about masks, you're talking about therapeutics, you're talking about vaccines. I think we've seen so many back and forth flip-flops from the CDC over how to reopen schools or what the guidance should be, from Stephen Hahn at the FDA about convalescent plasma, about different dimensions of this, and enormous eruption from the biopharmaceutical industry, but also from people within the national institutes criticizing the shortcuts that Navarro and others are trying to force. Let's work in Trump time, not the way science works. So I think that there is no credible way for a vaccine to be delivered, even if it were substantively, let's just give Putin some credit from it. What if Putin is right and he came up with a vaccine in Russia? There was an article in the Lancet today that was talking about, some of the strengths and positives of potentially of the Russia vaccine. So, maybe he rolled the dice, get it right, but it doesn't deal with the lack of trust in the system. And so rushing before, so my view is it does the opposite. I think people will remain skeptical and have a high degree of doubt with whatever, if there were to be a vaccine rush before the election, it would not redound. It would further divide both sides. Democrats would say we're not paying attention to science or scientists, and the Trump crowd would say, screw you, this is the way we're going because, great leaders said to do this. And then those in the independent area are gonna, I think, my guess is, they're going to look at this as an extension of the Keystone Cops operation when it has come to COVID. And COVID dominates every other issue right now in terms of wrong way, right way polling. And so I don't think that a vaccine by election day solves anything. I think it further divides the country if there were to be one designated.
John Allen, you agree?
I hesitate to predict the reaction to that, other than to say that if a vaccine were to be put out on November 1st, I think a lot of, 2 days before the election, a lot of people would look at that as a deadline driven by politics, that they were working backward from election day. And there would certainly be a lot of people who would be skeptical of it, as Steve says, as a political gimmick rather than a scientifically driven decision. I think we're all praying for a vaccine, tomorrow, yesterday, 6 months ago. Hopefully they are able to produce one, and hopefully they wouldn't, nobody would try to delay one that was working. But obviously you want it to be scientifically sound, and you want it to be safe. I have not heard people in the scientific community say that they believe that there will be a vaccine available by November 1st.
Okay, fair enough. I would be remiss if we did not talk about a little bit of foreign policy, since we are the New York Center for Foreign Policy Affairs and how it plays into this election. I want to ask a question to, let me start while I've got you on the big screen, John Allen. Why is it that let me digress for a second. One of the missions of the New York Center for Foreign Policy Affairs is to convey the message that foreign policy affects everyday lives, that a trade war with China isn't just some elite economists arguing about how we deal with trade in China, whether it's cheap steel or cheap products coming in, but it does affect how much you pay for a table at Walmart, or how quickly you can get an appliance from Home Depot. That being said, why is it that we are not seeing the foreign policy, other than obviously COVID and the racial questions that are up right now, but we don't see a lot of the foreign policy issues that have come up in these discussions, such as the pulling out of the World Health Organization, the tension with our own allies, let alone our adversaries. Is foreign policy something that you're finding could be on the mind of Americans, but just not in the forefront, or does it not matter anymore?
I think it comes to the fore in dramatic fashion sometimes, but it tends to be forgotten, in times of domestic crisis. So we've been dealing with the coronavirus crisis and the economic fallout of that, with the things that are closest to home. The world doesn't stop spinning. And so some of the foreign policy is related to coronavirus. When you talk about trade, we've seen the United States, at least rhetorically, take on, and in some, sort of demonstrable ways, take on a more protectionist bent. We've seen our International Development Finance Corporation, which is a new outfit that basically replaced OPIC and put in some of, not OPEC, but OPIC.
OPIC.
And took in some other agencies. We've seen that turned inward. So instead of making loans to foreign aid, they tried to make a loan to Kodak. That was put on hold. But the idea was to start making chemicals for pharmaceuticals because of all the importation of pharmaceuticals from China and materials for pharmaceuticals from China. So, and we've seen domestic manufacturing ramp up in the United States as a result of all the various materials that we're importing from China. So you see it in ways like that. You see announcements from the administration regarding the sort of new relationship between UAE and Israel, for example. And so you hear it a little bit, but it tends to be on the back burner unless there is some really sort of dramatic reason that it comes to the front burner. We will hear more about foreign policy when the two presidential candidates, when President Trump and Joe Biden debate each other. Foreign policy is baked in as one of the debate topics.
Stephen Clemens, I'm enjoying that puzzled look. Your thoughts on this?
I agree with John. I mean, I think that the genius of Trump, if there is such a thing, is that he convinced Americans something that many Americans have been feeling, that they have fought these wars, they have, been the security guarantor for the world, and what they got out of it was a really bad recession in 08, 09, and that China got all this power. And so, this notion that America fought the Cold War, but China won is palpable to a lot of Americans. And thus there's enormous enthusiasm, not only in his base, but among others as well, who are not necessarily devotees of Trump, that the payback, the quid pro quo that comes from American leadership in the world in global institutions is not something that's been benefiting them in their basic lives. And so I think that someone like Joe Biden gets this and can convey that, but no one has stepped forward to kind of go back and explain why America's global social contract and its leadership position fundamentally delivers good things to Americans. There hasn't been space in this campaign for that yet. And so when you kind of look at what John said, there's an ad hoc, by moment interest in it. But when you kind of look at foreign policy writ large and what America's greater purposes are in the world, there's very little enthusiasm for that right now. And it's typified, I think, mostly in the standoff with China. So China is becoming a placeholder for all that muck in the world that people don't trust and don't want to be engaged with.
Dan Lipner, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would basically agree. And I would also take it a step further and say it's already cooked into the numbers. The people who have their positions saying, China is to blame and Trump has been strong on China, they're already represented, and I don't think that number is getting any higher. The folks who are pissed off that we're retracting from the world, that their passport doesn't get them into as many countries as it did before, that's already cooked into the numbers. That's actually also accounts for a fair number of the Republican defections to Joe Biden, but we've still been able to record where those people have landed. Barring something extreme, and I mean something extreme like a 9/11 kind of event, something that actually hits us at home, it's hard for me to see foreign policy moving anyone in any credible way, since I think John is absolutely right. There are people who are starting with issues at home and things that are scaring them at home economically, and while foreign policy is part of that, the blame has already been laid and established for those folks, and I don't think they're going to move. So hopefully there won't be any large external negative event. I mean, if Russia pulls out the magical coronavirus and Americans taking it, which is its own kettle of disaster, which would it would almost be funny to see how that would work with the anti-vaxxer folks and the Russia's our friends, where the whole realignment occurred on that under Trumpism. But other than that, I just don't know what issues out there. Even the handful of good things that Donald Trump has pulled off with the Israel and the UAE and apparently Kosovo. It's not quite clear to me who's going to move on those issues. I don't think most Americans know Kosovo or what the UAE is. The Netanyahu supporting Americans that view Israel as a topic issue are already in the Trump camp, and the folks who have other views are already not in the Trump camp. They're just not going to move.
Well, we could go on for hours about this topic. We really could, but just one last question around the horn to everybody is, Time Magazine pretty much came out and said that politics as we know it has changed forever as a result of coronavirus and COVID. Do you agree with that assessment, and how has it changed in your mind? Let me start with Stephen Clemens and John Allen.
No, it's such a sweeping generalization. I mean, I think that what has happened is, the winners and losers when it comes to trust. So, you know, scientists, you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, it's an interesting place to look. Right now, this point of scientific authority is booming. The position of politicians, as usual, is not very high, but social trust largely is low. I don't think those are permanent conditions. I would be wary of saying that a crisis like this, America has been through other staggering crises that have created far worse fatalities. I mean, we've been talking, you know, about wars and wounded veterans and all this in the last day and a half. I mean, so we've been through really bad struggles before, and I don't think those necessarily change politics for all time. I mean, so I guess I'll just say there, no, I don't agree with that. I think things will bounce back at a point where there are vaccines and therapeutics. It won't be by November 3rd, but I do think that we will essentially deploy, because we will see that science saved us. So there will be, you know, an interesting opportunity there, and that there will be blame cast on those who were anti-science, at least for a time. And, you know, kind of like I raised this question the other day at a forum, and I said, look, I feel like we're in a weird time in our history where on one hand, the technological breakthroughs across the board that are going to transform us and what will be possible in this nation 5 years, 10 years out, staggering. But I think that Galileo, if we were to have the trial today, would lose.
Yeah.
So, you know, you have those two dynamics at play at the same time. So, but maybe it's always been that way.
See, I'm going to plagiarize the hell out of that statement. I love that. That's great. Thank you on that. John Allen, question to you.
I think the Indigo Girls just got some royalties.
Good to see you, Stephen Clemens. That's awesome. John Allen, your answer?
I think that, you know, on the one hand, you watch Congress in a time when everybody said, and the president, in a time when everybody said Washington is so dysfunctional. You watch Congress and the president push literally trillions of dollars out the door in response to coronavirus. You know, both in fiscal relief and in authority for the Federal Reserve to adjust monetary policy and sort of do some hybrid fiscal monetary stuff to try to rescue the economy. And it obviously worked better for shareholders than it did for what we call the real economy, certainly in the short term. You can quibble with how well that worked, or how, you know, or whether it didn't work, who it worked for, et cetera. You know, I've done a lot of reporting on who it worked well for and who it didn't work well for. That said, they moved quickly, very quickly, and in unison to do that at a time, again, when everybody was talking about how Congress can't get anything done, how the Republicans and Democrats can't get together, how Trump can't work with Congress. And so on the one hand, I look at it and I say, you know, maybe politics really hasn't changed forever. If there's a real crisis at hand, the politicians move, and if there's not, they fight a lot about stuff that doesn't matter. On the other hand, I think you see two really different visions of what the United States stands for between Trump and Biden. And we saw a clash of this in the last election, but it may be more defined this time. Trump really defines America in a sort of soil kind of sense, like in a territorial kind of sense. The borders of the United States, the people of the citizens of the United States. When you listen to Joe Biden, he talks about the idea of the United States, talks about the Constitution, does events from Philadelphia in front of, in front of the Constitution, or images of the Constitution. These are very different ideas of what are the important values of the country. You know, is it the physical space? Is it our turf and our people? Or is it the ideals of our republic? And so I wonder, you know, does that change significantly if Trump has another 4 years from, you know, what our sort of concept of the Republican democratic government is? And I mean that with the small r and the small d, because Trump has certainly pushed the boundaries of presidential power in ways that his predecessors, I think, have tried to, but have not been as effective with.
Dan Lipner?
I just want to say
go ahead. Stephen Clemens, go ahead.
I just want to say real quick, because I'm so culturally illiterate, I didn't know what John was talking about Indigo Girls. It's really cool.
Okay, I don't know who gets the 5 points. John Allen for citing Indigo Girls or Stephen Clemens for not knowing who the Indigo Girls were or the reference to Galileo.
I just want to know, Steve, did you originally think they were a female alternative to the Blue Man Group?
You know, I didn't know, but it's a good lyrics. Good lyrics.
Well, I'm also glad that the Indigo Girls have had, and by the way, I am a fan of the Indigo Girls, but that they found a new fan in Stephen Clemens. All right, let's try and go back to this. Dan Lipner, last comment to you, although I don't know if we need to.
So as far as does this change politics forever? The answer is yes, but the answer is always yes. The 2016 campaign that Donald Trump ran out of Trump Tower with a handful of operatives with no meaningful state-by-state or field campaign is something nobody has seen in the United States for more than a century. The 4 years prior to that, the Obama, excuse me, 8 years prior to that, the Obama campaign fundamentally changed the math with the kind of turnout that we had just never seen. So one of my favorite jokes from about the Obama campaign when he was running the primaries in 2008 was, what's the difference between a church revival and an Obama rally? And the answer is the Messiah doesn't make an appearance at a church revival. Going further back from that, both the Kerry Bush or Gore Bush were also changes in the dynamics. Karl Rove fundamentally changed the math in 2004 by attacking what was Kerry's perceived biggest strength as being a war hero, and the armchair Democrats that were trying to be strategists, thinking they could not possibly attack a war hero. Oops. Well, that was undone. The math is constantly changing. I've been doing this since 1992 when I was a young tyke volunteering for Bill Clinton. And the Bill Clinton campaign changed the math with his rapid response, how he reached out to folks, and his somewhat famous appearance on Arsenio Hall playing a saxophone. So the math is constantly changing, and the question is, who's got the next good move that will actually work, or who's going to look at past failures or past almost successes. Barack Obama's successes for the field were actually kind of an improvement of what Howard Dean had done 4 years prior, unsuccessfully. But people looked to it and said, okay, the beta test on this didn't work out so well, and we have a different candidate and a far more refined electronic outreach way of tracking things. So this election cycle is changing in a way that I think I'm a bit more uncomfortable with, that all of those things are at play, but it seems like that the biggest change is personality is what's governing most issues outright, regardless of substance. And I don't necessarily think that's a good thing for American politics, and I'm hoping that is an aberration for this cycle. Hillary Clinton had incredibly large negatives 4 years ago that were built up over her 20 years of political life, or more than that, actually. And Joe Biden never had negatives that high, in spite of all the money being thrown at him, both domestically and arguably internationally from other folks that might be interfering with American elections. His negatives aren't growing. And that might be the biggest difference, and potentially the outlier undoing what we may have seen part of in 2016. At least that's my hope, but it's still to be seen how that plays out.
Well, I will tell you, it's got the attention of America and the world, and we're all going to be watching for the next 60 days to see how this plays out. Stephen Clemens from The Hill, John Allen from NBC News, and Dan Lipner, political strategist extraordinaire. Thank you, all three of you guys, for your time, for joining us here at the Center for this really incredible discussion. I love these discussions, and it brings back memories of the old. Oh, thanks, Steve. That's very kind of you. I do have to give a special shout out to a couple of people. Alyssa Bonk, our program director. This never happens without the genius of Alyssa Bonk. I want to give a shout out to Kayla Murphy, our associate. Thank you, Kayla, for making me smarter on this stuff than I actually am. The rest of our staff for all the hard work that they put into making the New York Center for Foreign Policy Affairs successful. We will be having more of these. Hopefully, we'll start having them in person soon. But you can also check out the latest events and our latest statements, policy papers at NYCFPA.org. And you can also email me, justin.russell@nycfpa.org, if you have any questions, comments, or just want to send general fan mail. Again, everybody, be safe, be happy, and we will hope to see you again. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.